Hey, uh, just checking. Uh, start a new series in the hope that some people join me. I found a document that is extremely interesting, and so I'm going to move forward by reading the document. If you decide that you would like to join me, become a co-host. Um, I'm going to start doing this as often as possible. So you'll see me start off at around 11:30. I'm just going to start reading the document aloud and stating my opinion if I have one as we go along. Very deep information, very deep conversation, able to find and inform an extreme opinion regarding those who have an understanding of the growth of the nation and participate in the growth of the country uh, will agree with the historical facts and a lot of the things that are here. So, with that said, I'm just going to share the link a few times uh, in the live and hope that you guys decide to join me as I move forward here. So, again, this will be going on at night. If you're interested in getting on, commenting, feel free. We'll just do this as many nights as possible. We can come to upper understanding for some things that have happened in the past and start coming to better understanding for what needs to be done as we go into the future. I think I will also read this document and allow you to actually see the document so you're not just reading at the same time. Let's see. We're sharing this in a couple of groups before we get started. And anybody listening, feel free to give it a share. I'd love to invite you on. Leave a comment if you're interested in coming on. Give this one more share area. So the document. Share my screen. We have the system audio This thing does not allow me to hear that I'm aware of when you send a message. So I will check periodically. Uh, let's begin. This California Task Force study and develop reparation proposal for African Americans. Interim report. This one was submitted June 22nd or June 2022. A lot of credible entities taking place with this one. This is the executive summary. Introduction 1863. Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and in 1865, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution commanded that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. And supporting the passage of the 13th Amendment, its co-author, Senator Lyman Trumbull, Illinois, said that it is perhaps difficult to draw a precise line to say where freedom ceases and slavery begins. In 1883, the Supreme Court interpreted the 13th Amendment as empowering Congress to pass all laws necessary, proper for abolishing all badges and incidents of slavery in the States. However, throughout the rest of American history, instead of abolishing the badges and incidents of slavery, the United States federal, state, and local governments, including California, perpetuated and created new iterations of these badges and incidents. The resulting harms have been innumerable and have snowballed generations. The interim report is a general survey of its harms as part of the broader efforts of California Task Force to study and develop reparation proposals for African American reparations. The Reparation Task Force was established under the Assembly of Bill 3121 S. Weber in 2020, and the report of the task force is due to the legislature by June 1st, 2022. The final report will be issued before July 1st, 2023. The law charges the Reparations Task Force with studying the institution of slavery and its lingering negative effects on society and African Americans. The law requires the Reparations Task Force to recommend appropriate remedies, compensation, rehabilitation, and restitution of African Americans, with a special consideration for descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. This executive summary synthesizes many of the preliminary findings and recommendations of the Reparations Task Force. So thoroughly have the effects of slavery infected every aspect of Americans' society over the last 400 years that it's nearly impossible to identify every badge incident of slavery, to include every piece of evidence or describe every harm done to African Americans. In order to address this practical reality, the Interim report, the Reparations Task Force, describes a sample of government actions and compounding harms that have resulted. They've organized, they're organizing the 12 specific areas of systematic discrimination. In order to maintain slavery, government actors adopted white supremacy beliefs and passed laws to create racial hierarchy and to control both enslaved and free African Americans. In the United States Constitution recognized African Americans as citizens. On paper, government failed to give them full rights of citizenship and failed to protect and offer, sanction, and directly participate African Americans from widespread terror and violence, along with dereliction of its duty to protect its black citizens. Direct federal, state, and local government actions continue to enforce racist laws created to justify slavery. These laws, government supported cultural beliefs, have since formed the foundation of innumerable modern laws, policies, and practices across the nation. Today, 160 years after the abolition of slavery, its badges and incidents remain embedded in the political, legal, health, financial, educational, cultural, environmental, social, and economic systems of the United States of America. Racist, false, and harmful stereotypes created to support slavery continue to physically and mentally harm African Americans today, without a remedy specifically targeted to dismantle our country's racist foundations and heal the injuries inflicted by colonial and American governments. The badges of incidents of slavery will continue to harm African Americans almost all aspects of life. Enslavement to nationality. Foundation of America's wealth was built upon trafficking African peoples and their descendants, built by their forced labor and their bodies as they were bought and sold as commodities. American government at all levels allowed or participated in exploitation, abusing, terrorizing, and murdering people of African descent so that mostly white Americans could profit from the enslavement. After the war, independence, the United States built one of the largest and most profitable enslaved labor economies in the world. The government politically and financially supported slavery. The United States adopted a national constitution that protected slavery and gave pro-slavery white Americans outsized political power of the government. Half of the nation's pre-Civil War presidents enslaved African Americans while in office, and throughout history, more than 1,700 congressmen from 37 states once enslaved black people. By 1861, almost 2% of the entire budget of the United States went to pay for expenses related to enslavement, such as enforcing fugitive slave laws. Enslavers made more than 159 million dollars between 1820 and 1860 by trafficking African Americans within the United States. Charles Ball, an enslaved man, was bought by slave traffickers in Maryland and forced to march to South Carolina, later remembered, seriously meditated on self-destruction, and had I been at liberty to get a rope, I believe I should have hanged myself at Lancaster. I had now no hope of ever again seeing my wife and children, or revisiting the scenes of my youth. Historians have argued that many of today's financial, accounting, and management practices begin among enslavers in the United States, South, and Korea. In order to continually increase production profits, enslavers regularly staged public beatings and other violent acts and provided deplorable living conditions. Historians have also found evidence that enslavers raped and impregnated enslaved women and girls and profited from sexual violence by owning and selling their own children. President Thomas Jefferson, who enslaved four of his own children, wrote that the labor of breeding enslaved women who births a child every 2 years is as profitable as the best enslaved worker on the farm. In the census of 1860, the last census taken before the Civil War, of the about 12 million people living in 15 slave holding states, almost 4 million were enslaved. In order to terrorize and force this enormous population to work without pay, the colonial and American governments created a different type of slavery. Unlike in the historians' call for pre-modern era slavery in America was based on the idea that race was the sole basis for long life enslavement. Children were enslaved from birth, and that people of African descent were naturally destined to be destined to be enslaved. Colonists in North America claimed and passed laws to maintain a false racial hierarchy where white people were naturally superior. Colonial laws effectively made it legal for enslavers to kill the people they enslaved. In some states, free nor enslaved African Americans could not vote or hold public office. Enslaved people could not resist a white person, leave a plantation without permission, or gather in large groups away from plantations. Taking a look at this, it says the American colonial slave codes create, created a new type of slavery that was different than slavery which existed in pre-modern times. Babies were enslaved at birth for their entire lives and for the entire lives of their children and their children's children. These laws denied political, legal, and social rights to free the enslaved black people alike in order to more easily control enslaved people. These laws divided white people from black people by making interracial marriage a crime. And these laws survived well into the 20th century. The Supreme Court only declared that outlawing interracial marriage was unconstitutional in 1967. After the War of Independence, the American government continued to pass laws to maintain this false racial hierarchy, which treated all black people as less than human. After the Civil War, the federal government failed to meaningfully protect the rights of lives of African Americans. When Andrew Johnson became president after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, he proclaimed in 1866, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." Slave codes were reborn as black codes and then as the Jim Crow laws, segregating black white Americans in every aspect of life. Although many of the laws were most prominent in the South, they reflected a national desire to reinforce racial hierarchy based on white supremacy. California. Despite California entering the Union in 1850 as a free state, its early state government supported slavery. Pro-slavery, white Southerners held a great deal of power in the state legislature, court system, and California representatives in the United States Congress. Some scholars estimate that up to 1,500 enslaved African Americans lived in California in 1852. Enslaved people trafficked, trafficked to California, often worked under dangerous conditions, lived in unclean environments, and faced brutal violence. In 1852, California passed and enforced a fugitive slave law. was harsher than the federal fugitive slave law, and this made California a more pro-slavery state than most other free states. California also outlawed non-white people from testifying in any court case involving white people. California did not ratify the 14th Amendment until 1959, which protected the equal rights of all citizens, and the 15th Amendment, which prohibited states from denying a person's right to vote on the basis of race until 1962. In italics, the picture Hampton, Virginia, slab town. After the Civil War, African Americans lived in large segregated refugee camps like Slab Town because it was now here, or there was nowhere else for them to go. Hospitals, dispensaries, and military camps were unable to serve the masses and enslaved people. Black soldiers and other refugees who entered the North due to Civil War escaped and abandoned formerly enslaved people settled near or within the United Army's military camps and battle lines. The camps did not have adequate sanitation, nutrition, or medical care. One out of every 4 African Americans who lived in the camps died. Racial terror. Nationally, after slavery, white Americans frequently aided by the government maintained the badges of slavery by carrying out violence and intimidation against African Americans for decades. Racial terror pervaded every aspect of post-slavery Black life and prevented African Americans from building the same wealth, political influence as white Americans. African Americans faced threats of violence when they tried to vote. They tried to buy homes in white neighborhoods, when they tried to swim in public pools, and when they tried to assert equal rights through the courts or in the legislature. White mobs bombed, murdered, and destroyed entire towns, while states and local governments ignored the violence, failed to refuse to prosecute offenders, or participate in the violence themselves. Racial terror takes direct forms such physical assaults, threats of injury, and destruction of property. It also inflicts psychological trauma on those who witness the harm and injury. Many African Americans were traumatized from surviving mass violence, with the constant terror of living in the South. Lynchings in the American South were not isolated hate crimes committed by rogue vigilantes, but part of a systematic campaign of terror to enforce racial hierarchy. Racial terror targeted at successful African Americans has contributed to the present wealth gap between blacks and white Americans. while lynching and mob murders are no longer the social norm. Scholars have argued that its modern equivalent continues to haunt African Americans today as extrajudicial killings by the law enforcement and civilian vigilantes. Racial terrors remains as a tool from other forms of discrimination and control of African Americans, from redlining, segregated schools, to desperate health care, and dramatic bank runs. Let me take a check real quick to see if anybody's in here. Okay. And again, if anybody wants to participate, wants to come in, let me know. I'll send you a link. Just send me a comment. Say what's up. Say what the business is if you're listening. I'll be doing this every day. Just read until I feel like uh, retiring for the evening. So the Ku Klux Klan. Let me see where I started. California. Supported by the government. Ordinary citizens also terrorized and murdered Black Californians. The Ku Klux Klan established local chapters all over the state in the 1920s. In that time, California, at the same times, even held more KKK events than Mississippi or Louisiana. Many of the Californians, KKK members, were prominent individuals, well positioned in civil leadership and police departments. For example, in the 1920s, Los Angeles, prominent and numerous city government officials were KKK members or had KKK ties, including the mayor, district attorneys, and police officers. Violence against African Americans peaked in the 1940s as more Black Californians tried to buy homes in Black neighborhoods. Today, police violence against and extrajudicial killings of African Americans occur in California in the same manner as they do in the rest of the country. Political disenfranchisement, national African Americans have pursued equal political participation since before the Civil War. But the federal, state, and local governments of the United States have suppressed and continue to suppress Black votes and Black political power after the Civil War. The United States protected the voting rights of the African Americans on paper, but not in reality. During the 12-year period after the Civil War, called Reconstruction, the federal government tried to give newly freed African Americans access to basic civil rights. And by 1868, more than 700,000 Black men were registered to vote in the South. During Reconstruction, over 1,400 African Americans held federal, state, or local office, and more than 600 served in state assemblies. However, the progress was short-lived. During the contested presidential election of 1876, Republicans and Democrats agreed to withdraw federal troops from key locations in the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. Southern states then willfully ignored the voting protections in the United States Constitution, passed literacy tests, poll taxes, challenger laws, grandfather clauses, and other devices to prevent African Americans from voting. States also barred African Americans from, from serving on juries. This is definitely a part of where I have thought. So I start thinking about how African Americans become barred from civil activities, rights that are conclusive of the system. You know, aside from lack of progress and all the other things that are happening, we end up having to stand for these things. And the amount of time that we waste coming together, standing for these small things, voting, equal incomes, those types of things. Then these larger things, homes, land, the right to pursue equity, and all these other things don't come fast enough because we had to waste time on the small stuff. In reality, the original thought process upon birth would actually be the grant of well-being and your right to reach your full potential. Let's continue. This target government action was extremely effective in stripping African Americans of what little political power gained during the Reconstruction era. An example, in 1867, black turnout in Virginia was 90%. After Virginia's voter suppression laws took effect, the number of black voters dropped from 147,000 to 21,000. During Reconstruction, 16 black men held seats in Congress. From 1901 until 1970s, not a single African American served in Congress. It's my brave app. I get paid for using this app. So, if you're interested in finding out. These government actions returned white supremacists to power in local, state, and federal government. Historians have argued that racist lawmakers elected from southern states blocked hundreds of federal civil rights laws and rewrote many of the country's most important pieces of legislation to exclude or discriminate against African Americans. For example, the New Deal, a series of federal laws and policies designed to pull America out of the Great Depression, created the modern white middle class, and many of the programs that African Americans depend on today, such as Social Security. The New Deal excluded African Americans from its benefits. Historians have argued that Southern lawmakers ensured that Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, commonly known as the GI Bill, was administered in the states and the federal government level to guarantee that the states could direct its funds to white veterans. Similarly, more secure support of Southern lawmakers. Congress included segregation clauses and rejected anti-discrimination clauses in the hospital code and Reconstruction Act, Reconstruction Act of 1946, commonly known as the Borough Act, which paid for our modern healthcare infrastructure. The same tactics were applied to the American Housing Act of 1949, which helped white Americans buy single-family homes. These federal legislative decisions ensuring the government-sanctioned discrimination of African Americans for decades to come and perpetuates the racial hierarchy. I think about these things, I go back to the understanding that upon abolishment, there's an offer, even during the time, there's another offer. Well, they're actually offered 160 acres to the people of the time if they were capable of, within a certain period of time, building on the land and maintaining it. At the same time, that offer plus the offer of 40 acres in the middle to the African American former slave, none of which was received. And then today, you find that most of these people don't pile that land, the 160 acres. I'm sure that most of them went and received it. And even if not, the offer is still there. You would find that when you go in these situations, there were issues applying for and follow through, complete follow through. And then half a century later, or a century later, or a century and a half later, even now another clause to get Caucasian Americans into homes and separating the African American from it as a whole. California also passed and enforced laws to prevent Black Californians from accumulating political power. California passed a law prohibiting non-white witnesses from testifying against white Californians. This law shielded white defendants from justice. The California Supreme Court explained that any non-white person to testify would admit them all the equal rights of citizenship. And we might soon see them all at polls and the jury box, on the bench, in our legislative halls, a prospect that the court viewed as an actual and present danger. California did not allow Black men to vote until 1879. The state also passed many of the voter suppression laws that were used in the South. California prohibited individuals convicted of felonies out of the poll tax, put in place a literacy test. Literacy test to vote, I don't know. Maybe a literacy test to get job. The act of having to fill out an application over and over again seems redundant. You got tests like, uh, little tests that enable your assessment of typing and using software, yet still having to write um, with a pencil to fill out an application. Having to see the words on the paper and fill out the questionnaire. Are you a white American? Uh, do you agree to at will employment? Just so that you can be shunned and kicked around by an insufficient person in place that was able to read better than you. Couldn't calculate proper answer regarding technicality and had to bring you into argument so that you could claim you as the individual who gave the wrong answer, as he's supposed to be the what would you call him in that case, the expert supervisor calling you in. Could you explain how the epiphany of the broken measure of argument came to be? This is becomes a redundant conversation. When you have the understanding that these things are happening and they can be placed in this fashion and presented. Rehousing, segregation, national. America's racial hierarchy was a foundation for our system. Segregation in the United States after several years. The aim of segregation was not only to separate, but also to force African Americans to live in worse conditions in nearly every aspect of life. Government actors working with private individuals actively segregated America into black and white neighborhoods. Although this system of segregation was called Jim Crow in the South, it existed by less obvious but effective means throughout the entire country, including California. During slavery, 90% of African Americans were forced into the South. Immediately after the Civil War, the country was racially and geographically configured into ways that were different from the way it is separated today. Throughout the 20th century, American federal, state, and local municipal governments expanded and solidified segregation through zoning ordinances, slum clearance policies, construction, parks, and freeways through black neighborhoods, and public housing sitting decisions. Courts enforce racial covenants that prevented homes from being sold to African Americans well into the 1940s. Federal government used redlining to deny African Americans equal access to capital needed to buy a single family home, while at the same time subsidizing white African Americans' efforts to own the same type of home. As President Herbert Hoover stated in 1931, single family homes were expressions of racial belonging and that our people should live in their own homes is a sentiment deep in the heart of our race. Passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968 outlawed housing discrimination, but it did not fix the structures put in place by hundreds of years of discriminatory government policies, and residential segregation continues today. The average urban black person in 1890 lived in a neighborhood that was only 27% black. In 2019, America is segregated as it was in the 1940s. The average urban black person living in the neighborhood that is 44% black, better jobs, tax dollars, municipal services, healthy environments, good schools, access to health care, and grocery stores have followed white residents to the suburbs, leading concentrated poverty, underfunded schools, collapsing infrastructure, polluted water and air, crime and food deserts, and segregated inner city neighborhoods. California, every state, local government created segregation through redlining zones, ordinances, decisions on where to build schools, highways, discriminatory federal mortgage policies. California sundown towns, a term derived from municipal signs announcing that African Americans must leave by dusk, like most of the suburbs of Los Angeles and San Francisco, prohibited African Americans from living in entire cities throughout the state. The federal government financed many whites-only neighborhoods throughout the state. Federal homeowners loan corporation maps unused redlining describe many California neighborhoods in racial discriminatory terms. For example, in San Diego, there were suburban areas, La Jolla, and several areas restricted to Caucasian race. During World War II, the federal government paid housing, beds, workers, housing for black workers generally better constructed and permanent. While white workers lived in rooms, paid for government, black wartime workers lived in cargo shacks, barns, tents, open fields. Racially restrictive covenants, which were clauses in property deeds that unusually allowed only white residents to live on the property described in the deed, were commonplace. California courts enforced them well into the 1940s. Numerous neighborhoods around the state rezoned black neighborhoods for industrial use to steer white residents toward better neighborhoods or adopt zoning ordinances to ban apartment buildings to try and keep out prospective black residents. State agencies demolish thriving black neighborhoods in the name of urban renewal, park construction, operating under the state law for urban redevelopment. The city of San Francisco declared Western Addition uh, blighted, and destroyed film in San Francisco, most prominent black neighborhood business district. In doing so, the city of San Francisco closed 883 businesses, displaced 4,729 households, destroyed 250,000 Victorian homes, and damaged the lives of nearly 20,000 people. The city then left the land empty for many years. In the past, social vulnerability or legacy of redlining. Image on the left shows redlining map of California made by the homeowners loan corporation during 1930. Red portions of non-white neighborhoods deemed by the federal agency to be credit risks. Map on the right centered the disease controls social vulnerability index scores for census tracts today. Stand there saying social vulnerability index is widely used to assess the community's capacity to prepare for, respond to, and recover from human natural disasters. The red portion indicates the highest level of vulnerability to disasters. Separate and unequal education. Let's see, national. Much of American history, enslavers, and the white political ruling class of American foster believed it was their best interest to deny education to African Americans in order to dominate and control them. Slave states denied education to nearly all enslaved people. While the North and Midwest segregated their schools and limited or denied access to free black people. After slavery, Southern states maintained racial hierarchy by legally segregating black and white children, and white-controlled legislatures funded black public schools far less than white public schools. Alabama State legislator stated in 1889, education was well a good plowhand. Black teachers received lower wages, and white children received fewer months of schooling per year, fewer years of schooling per lifetime of each other. Contrary to what Americans were taught, the United States Supreme Court's landmark 1954 case, Brown versus Broad, Brown versus Board of Education, which established that racial segregation in public schools is unconstitutional, not market segregation. That's why non-white school districts get $23 billion less than predominantly white districts. After Brown versus the board, many white people, like dominated school boards throughout the country, actively resisted immigration. In the South, segregation was still in place in the 1970s with massive resistance from white communities. The rest of the country, including California, education segregation occurred when government-sanctioned housing segregation combined with school assessment and setting policies. As children attended schools in their neighborhood, and school finance was tied to property. Most white children attended segregated schools with less funding and resources than schools attended by white children. In 1974, the United States Supreme Court allowed this type of school segregation to continue in schools if it reflected residential segregation patterns between the cities and suburbs. As a result, this other United States Supreme Court decision that followed to further undetermine undermine, okay, followed to further undermine desegregation efforts. Many public schools in the United States were integrated and then resegregated or never integrated in the first place. In 1874, California Supreme Court ruled segregation in states' public schools was legal. A decision that predated the United States Supreme Court infamous separate but equal 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson by 22 years. In 1966, in the South, the process of desegregating 85% of Black Californians attended predominantly minority schools, and only 12% of Black students and 39% of white students attended racially balanced schools. In the South, Californians fought desegregation, and a number of schools, districts, courts had to order districts to desegregate. Any progress obtained through court enforced desegregation was short-lived. By the mid to late 1970s, courts turned, limited, or ignored desegregation orders in many California districts as the Supreme Court and Congress limited methods to integrate schools. In 1979, California passed Proposition 1, which further limited segregation efforts tied to busy, busting. Are you a business or a busser? The vast majority of California school districts schools either resegregated or never integrated. Thus segregated schools persist today. California remains the sixth most segregated state in the country for black students. California's high segregated schools mostly attended by white and Asian children, receive more funding and resources than schools with predominantly black and Latino children. Seven, racism, employment infrastructure. Nationally, due to residential segregation, Americans have lived poor quality housing throughout American history, exposing them to disproportionate amounts of lead poisoning and increasing risks of infectious disease. Segregated black neighborhoods have more exposure to hazardous waste, oil and gas production, automobile and diesel fuels, and are more likely to have inadequate public services, sewage lines, and drinking water. African Americans are more vulnerable than white Americans to the dangerous effects of extreme weather patterns such as heat waves, made worse by the effects of human consumption and industrial degradation of the national patterns are replicated in California. Black Californians are more likely than white Californians to live in overcrowded housing and near hazardous waste. Black neighborhoods are more likely to lack tree count and suffer from consequences of water, air pollution. For instance, Black Californians in San Joaquin Valley were excluded from most urban areas with access to clean water as a result of redlining policies, racial covenants, and racial motivation violence. There's definitely something that I was not aware of. We made a big thing about uh, water contamination and issues in Detroit, uh, but I wasn't aware that these things were happening all over the country in the past, and they're probably still happening in certain areas, especially when it comes to lead poisoning in the pipes and dirty water and type of plumbing systems. And to Blair County, a largely black community of Tennessee had no access to sewer and water infrastructure, while the adjacent white community of Pixton did. This discrimination continued until recently. The town of Lanier, formed by black families fleeing the Dust Bowl, had no running water at all until the 1970s and was subject to dangerous levels of arsenic in the water, even after wells and pipes were drilled. The town's residents did not get access to clean drinking water until 2019. In the 1950s, developer of Milpitas, California, tried to build a housing development for both white and black homeowners. In response, Milpitas Council increased the sewer connection fee more than tenfold to thwart the development. Pathologizing the black family. Government policies and practices at all levels destroy black families throughout American history. After the Civil War, some state governments enslaved children, making them apprentices of children. Not apprentices and forcing them to labor for white Americans, who were sometimes their former enslavers. Century, state and federal government financial assistance and children welfare systems have based decisions on racist beliefs created to maintain slavery and which continue to operate today as badges of slavery. Government issued financial assistance has excluded African Americans from receiving benefits. In the early 1900s, state governments made support payments every month to low-income single mothers to assist them with expenses they incurred while raising children. Black families were generally excluded despite their greater need. Scholars have found that racial discrimination exists at every stage of the child welfare system. The data show how unequally poor black and white families are compared, even where both families are considered to be at equal risk of future abuse. State agencies are more likely to remove black children from their families than white children. As of 2019, white children make up only 14% of American children, and yet 23% of the children are in foster care. Studies have shown that this is likely not because black parents mistreated their children more often, but rather due to racist systems and poverty. In the 2015-16 school year, black students were arrested at 3 times the rate of white students, while only comprising 15% of the population in schools. This disparity widens from black girls, who make up 17% of the school population, but are arrested at 3.3 times the rate of white girls. Meanwhile, criminal and juvenile justice systems have intensified these harms to black families by imprisoning large numbers of black children, thereby separating black families. California Children's Child Welfare Juvenile System and disciplinary action in schools match those in the rest of the country. Recent California Attorney General investigations have found several school districts punish black students at higher rates than students of other races. Investigations of Barstool Unified School District and Oroville City Elementary School District and Oroville Union High School District showed that black students were more likely to be punished and or suspended and are subjected to greater punishments than similarly situated peers in other races. Check to see if anybody's in here. Make sure I'm not ignoring y'all. Make sure you're in. Again, I'm just reading this document out loud. This is the full interim report, 2000, June 2022. There's supposed to be another one submitted next year, I think July 2023. This is in California, and so they've been opening up studies to grant reparations to the African descendants of former slaves, and literally, uh, this is extremely information. And so, I started reading it and I said to myself, what, I'm gonna start reading this out loud. If anybody wants to join me, talk about it, have any information additional, no matter what part of the country you're in, you see this, you're interested in it, just say what's up. Send me a quick comment. I'll get to it as soon as I can. Um, to join me in analyzing all of this and taking it apart and giving a presentation. Welcome. I appreciate your input. Just don't leave any harsh comments or negative influences during the study. 2015 study ranked California among the 5 worst states in foster care racial disparities. Black children in California make up approximately 22% of the foster population, while only 6% of the general children population, far higher than the national percentages. Some countries in California, both urban and rural, have much higher disparities compared to the statewide average. In San Francisco County, which is largely urban and has nearly 900,000 residents, the percentage of black children in foster care in 2018 was more than 25 times the rate of white children. Control over creative, cultural, and intellectual life. Nationally, during slavery, state governments controlled and dictated the forms and content of African American artistic and cultural production. Advocates argue this is still true today. After the Civil War, governments and politicians embrace mysteries, minstrels, minstrelsy, which was the popular, racist, and stereotypical depiction of African Americans through song, dance, and film. Federal and state governments failed to protect black artists and creators from discrimination and simultaneously promoted discriminatory narratives. There are estimates that racial violence accounts for 1,100 missing parents that should have been given to African Americans. Patents. I'm like, what? Parents I thought we were talking about children here. So these estimates of racial violence account for 1,100 missing patents that should have been given to African Americans. Cyrus McCormick received a patent for a mechanical reaper, even though it was actually invented by Joe Anderson, a man who was enslaved by the McCormick family. I believe that federal and state governments allowed white Americans to steal black art and culture with impunity, depriving black creators of valuable copyright and patent protections. That's another thing. Uh, so I mean, that's a big problem because when I think about it in the seriousness, um, reality, I'm gonna say this thing is consistent. It's terrible. I know that when I started filing for my copyrights, I think was closest to my downfall. When started trying to start a business and those types of things, that was when I was having a hard time finding a job. By the time I found a job, it was always in the height of the economy. By the time the economy is sloping to the next level, an argument with the environment, normally the management. The argument has absolutely nothing to do with my incapability, but the system. And I'm having, disconnection, illegal terminations, problems when I go into the government to seek reward due to damages, and literally just bad situations. And this thing just depicts answers over and over again. As for these things happening, in truth, I remember a fight that I was having with Rolling Corporation, one of my first lawsuits. Not the first, I think maybe even the second, where I bought a piece of equipment, uh, called for instruction. I had saved several copyrights, and I was only asking for instruction for the transfer. Spoke to a manager. The manager gave me instruction that erased the intellectual property. The amount of anger that's set, and then taking it to the other level, bringing it into court, and they're not able to calculate. Still a violation. It's still deserved reward. They should have still been punished in one way, shape, or form. Open the door for some stability for the young man. Make sure that you send them a couple of items to display. Something. Of course, state governments lack entrepreneurs and culture makers access to leisure sites, business licenses, and funding for lifestyle activities that were offered to white people. State governments built monuments, memorialized the Confederacy as just and heroic through monumental buildings, while simultaneously suppressing the nation's history of racism, slavery, and genocide. State-centered cinematic depictions of discrimination are also censoring depictions of black people integrating into society. In California, city governments disseminate thriving black neighborhoods with vibrant artistic communities at the Fillmore, San Francisco. But governments in California have discriminated against, punished, and penalized black students for their fashion, hairstyle, and appearance. State-funded California museums excluded black art from their institutions. California has criminalized black rap artists, as California courts have allowed rap lyrics to be used as evidence related to street gang activity. California has been home to numerous racist monuments and memorials for centuries. These things we hear about constantly all the time. They're talking about really taking out statues and regarding intellectual property and that kind of stuff. Hip hop, uh, especially in California, where the spirit projects by way of its learning experiences and uses of communication in the most creative fashion possible. Um, and then even further, you know, uh, in some cases, even purposely playing devil's advocate. Uh, a white man literally, in some cases, you hate to call it, you know, you hate to call a person out for the reality of the situation, but you realize that there's a point where he thinks he's some kind of god, uh, forcing the negative to happen while perpetrating negative and then punishing the negative. It's terrible. California has been home to numerous racist monuments for centuries. So I'm going to end with this one tonight. Stolen labor and hindered opportunity. It's undeniable that the labor of enslaved Africans built the infrastructure of the nation, produced its main agricultural products from domestic consumption of export and wild nation's coffers. Since then, for state and local government actions directly segregated and discriminated against African Americans. In 1913, President Woodrow Wilson officially segregated much of the federal workforce, while African Americans have consistently served in military since in the very beginning of the country. The military has historically paid black soldiers less than white soldiers and often deemed African Americans unfit for service until the military needed them to fight. Federal laws have also protected white workers while denying the same protection to black workers, empowering private discrimination. Approximately 85% of black workers in the United States at the time were excluded from protections passed by the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. Protections such as federal minimum wage, maximum number of working hours, required overtime pay, limits on child labor. The act essentially allowed child labor in industry setting and where most white children worked and allowed child labor in agricultural and domestic work where most black children worked. I remember growing up as a child, uh, I think child labor laws, you have to be 16 to have a job. And, we were organized as children to get in a van and go door to door selling candy. And I actually participated in that off and on for 13 years. Uh, come to find out that the people didn't pay taxes. And how would you pay taxes on a child at 14, 14, 15 years old? You can't even, the child ain't even supposed to be working. I'm saying, and then they got charged, if I'm not mistaken, they got charged for tax evasion when they closed. I think the reality of the situation is those people got rich, had an ability to actually transition, and would have probably got in trouble for the age difficulty. Still could have transitioned into something else, paid a quick fine and got out of it. Uh, I find even more a struggle inside the workplace, regardless of age. Uh, Skin color, those types of things. When you go inside, they say how many, 15% of people are African Americans. They say at the same time, 45% are, of the people are of all different colors. Well, why doesn't that reflect when you go inside the workplace at any given point? Doesn't reflect 45% difference. Those numbers are not conclusive as to who you've hired, who you've trained, who you've enabled progress by any means, not by way of allowing those who are not former slaves, or as long as they're minorities. You're, and the mentality just continues when we try to get it together to where we are forcefully, creating our own ability. Oh, attack! Let's pull out. No, they can't do that. No, that ain't us do that. We gotta tell them to do that. Right? So, I am one that has grown up around these people, and I've seen the worst of them and the best of them. And, just in going by way of understanding, going into reality by way of what they're calling the Willie Lynch letter. So Willie Lynch still see some of these behavior patterns and these issues, and so I seek to further offer a different type of progress. I believe it becomes a personality issue in reality. Still today, transitioning out of homelessness being forced around drug addicts and people willing to abuse and break the law and invite in abuse versus turning around, ho- understanding that you got a change coming for yourself to enjoy, uh, living a healthy, better life, and waiting to stand for this to actually happen and be certain that it happens, versus being threatened by each other, having problems with structures that are allowed for everyone to use, public structure, common areas like the laundry, where everybody's supposed to be able to use the laundry room, but somehow you know there's a possibility for a conflict at all. These people will be up all night. Can use that laundry room anytime they need to at night. And it turns into an issue when I walk into the laundry room. Leave their clothes in the laundry room for days, and it turned into an issue when I go into the laundry room. Break the door hinge over and over again upon entrance, as well as the dryer door hinge. And are still allowed in the establishment. And we read these things, we try to have an understanding, form an understanding. I think more we need to start coming together, those who have the better understanding, and cause apply an order. Two things need to start happening immediately. First, those who are capable and willing to accept self embetterment need to be offered proper training. Okay. Second, there needs to be an order to disconnect from the drugs and the abuse. Third, I think there needs to be an order to start applying a separate mechanism of discipline versus punishment to the children. Well, those things are happening constantly, but I'd like to see it done on a national level. So again, I'm Prentice Johnson. I appreciate you guys joining me tonight. We left off on page 13, 21 on the system, and we'll start again tomorrow. At this point, I hope to see you there.